For purposes, I happen to use this Korean edition because I like the notes and I could take more notes. It's larger. I can pencil in my own things. And even though it is quite thorough, it's good enough, but you could add a lot. And they even make notes sometimes of what Rav Kapach has to say. Sometimes I like to use, and I'd prefer also to have with me the Frankel edition because that has all the up-to-date classical commentaries thereon. Earlier today, we read Parashat Bo, and the sages say that one of their teachings is that the Holy One, blessed be He, gave the Israelites commandments to perform in Egypt so that they would merit the redemption. Now, the time had come for the redemption, and it seems that God, so to speak, had already decided way back in the beginning of Parashat Shemot that the redemption had to happen. And now it's kind of strange that only right before the last plague and the Exodus are the Israelites given commandments to perform, and that's what's going to get them out, as though there was a question about this thing, and it's kind of weird that it should be saved all the way to the end. Now, I don't know why necessarily it's saved to the end, but I think if we have a Maimonidean understanding of these commandments, we can begin to have an answer. And that is, it's not like, unfortunately, let's say children and other people of, other youngsters, people of who are still children in the mind, the way they believe that mitzvahs work. They think that performing a commandment earns us points in the world to come, and that's it. If you could just get as much mitzvah points as possible, you accumulate enough of them, and they outweigh your Avera points, so you're going to get them to Olam Haba, and perhaps in this world you also merit a few things. So Am Yisrael just needs to get a few more mitzvah points in the bank in order for the redemption to happen. Now, while those types of ideas, they serve a good metaphor for understanding how the world works, they're a little bit too simplistic. I believe that it's more along the lines that our commandments are for our benefit, like Maimonides says. We perform the commandments in order to improve ourselves and also to improve Am Yisrael. They're good for us. The commandments were given for Am Yisrael's benefit, and through them, Am Yisrael become fit to be redeemed. So we have the idea now that if only do what God has actually wanted us to be doing all along, perhaps the redemption would happen. Am Yisrael was on the brink of redemption. They just needed to do something in order to show that, and that they're ready to go ahead with the next stage of history. And I find it an amazing parallel to today. Today, we are given the opportunity to perform commandments that we had no opportunity to perform in years past. I spoke recently about the renewal of them, the commandment to put techeleth in our CC. There's been opposition to that, which makes no sense to me. Why would you oppose the renewal of a mitzvah? And people even claimed, they say there's I never heard this directly, but they say Rav Yashiv was opposed to Tcheles because Mashiach's not here yet, and it's only supposed to be revealed with the advent of the Messiah. And you could turn on them and say, perhaps that is an indication we're in messianic times because the Tcheles has come back. We have the opportunity to perform many commandments which we were not able to perform in years past. We have the opportunity to, of course, wear Tcheles, and we have the opportunity now to visit the temple. It is quite clear that if we wanted to, we could, for example, we could have the temple service renewed if we would just put our mind to it. That is basically the way Am Yisrael was in Egypt. They were sitting on the brink of redemption. If they would just have done that which they did, they would be redeemed. And it worked out for them. And we're in a similar boat. There's no prophet telling us directly, do this. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't say in the Torah, do these commandments and you will merit to leave Egypt. But we know that is the truth. And right now, we're sitting on this right now. We're sitting on the brink of redemption. If we would just do what God wants us to do, we will be fit to be redeemed. We'll bring it about ourselves. And as we know, the redemption is something that's not magical. It is a state of affairs that we bring upon ourselves when we step up into history. And with that in mind, we'll open up the beginning of the Hilchot, Beit, HaBechira, which is this evening. And God willing, we'll cover a chapter a day, so we'll try to do it every week, Motzei Shabbat, at this same time and place, although we might switch locations eventually as things improve. And we'll begin. So the Rambam begins most of his commandments, most of his summations of the halachot, with a very good method of first telling us what commandments are entailed, positive commandments, negative commandments, or rabbinic commandments if applied. And in this case, he's going to start with the basic commandment to build a mikdash, which I will translate as a sanctuary, as opposed to, let's say, temple, which is something that did not exist until Solomon built his sanctuary, which was a full-size temple. But sanctuary is the halachic term that covers all the different incarnations of the sanctuary, be it the tabernacle or a temple or something in between. For example, in Shilo, like we've discussed before, it wasn't the tabernacle, the one that was deconstructed and erected in various places in the wilderness, and then once again in the land of Israel. That's just the tabernacle. What existed at Shiloh was a permanent structure of stone, but with the same tripartite covering of the original tabernacle. So that was just a sanctuary. I wouldn't call it a temple. I wouldn't call it necessarily a tabernacle, even though in some cases it is, although it was missing essential components. But all the kelim inside were the same. Also, the Rambam didn't call this, let's say, Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, which is the common term for the temple. Instead, he calls it Beit HaBechira. And that harks back to the language used in the book of Deuteronomy, the place that God shall choose, which was, of course, a reference also to Shiloh and to Jerusalem. And it also is reminiscent to the formulation of the sages, when the sages say that Jews were given 3 commandments upon their entering the land of Israel: to appoint a king, to eliminate the seed of Amalek, and to build the Beit HaBechira. Beit HaBechira includes Shiloh and Jerusalem as the place that God shall choose, also perhaps Nov and Givon, as we discussed before. There is one term which is used solely for Jerusalem, and that'd be Beit Olamim, the eternal temple. Only Jerusalem is referred to as Beit Olamim, because that was, once it was the temple, the sanctuary was set up there, and the temple was inaugurated, it became forbidden to ever conduct the service or to build a sanctuary anywhere else in the world, despite people's attempts to do so. We've seen also examples in history where rival temples, rival sanctuaries were built in Beit El, in Dan, and in Heliopolis, of all places, out in Egypt. So that is the reason for this, for why Maimonides chose to call the Mikdash, in this case, Beit HaBechira, even though he, throughout this treatise and throughout the entire book of Avodah and Korbanot, he refers to the temple in its various incarnations as a Mikdash or Beit HaMikdash. Very interesting. So this word's going to basically disappear as we study the halachot. He says, "Mitzvah say la'asot b'ayit la'Hashem, luchad lichot makrivim allow korbanot v'cholchim allow shalosh pa'amim b'shana." It is a positive commandment of the Torah to build a temple. Bayith, by the way, in Hebrew, doesn't just mean house. It means any structure or anything that's indoors, basically. So when we speak in English, we could say a house, we could say temple. Either are fitting translations. I'm going to use both. I'm going to try to stay consistent, but I might not be able to. And he's saying that this structure is built for God. By the way, that's the way it is in the first 3. It's not mentioned that much in the book of Genesis. The next 3 books of the Torah, as opposed to the 5th book, Deuteronomy, where it's a house for God's name. It uses a less anthropomorphic term, which makes sense because it's in Moses' language, not God's language. You have to build this house for God, which is wherein we're ready to bring sacrifice, and also where pilgrimages made there too 3 times a year. And Nachmanides, as noted here at the bottom, felt that it's not necessarily that there's a higher purpose, which is a place for the revelation of the divine presence, a place where we can actually go and meet God. And as I pointed out last time, it was a few months ago already, it seems to be that the Midrash has this idea that it doesn't say that the Mishkan was originally built just to house the Ark of the Covenant, Perhaps that's the Ikar, and the answer is no. It was built in the desert originally to house the Ark of the Covenant. The Ikar of a Mikdash is perhaps where to perform these commandments. So Maimonides is perhaps assumes yes. The main point is that there should be a godly revelation and encounter the Shekhinah, but first you have to perform the commandments there. And Ramban is seeing beyond, let's say, these basic commandments. Either way, Maimonides continues and says, "We asuli mikdash." That's the pasuk as a source. That's right at the beginning of Parashat Terumah, where we are introduced to the Mishkan and the Ohel Moed. The Mishkan is the tabernacle, Ohel Moed is the tent of meeting, and it's only there in the book of Exodus, the Mishkan, the temple is called the house of God. We might be losing internet very soon, but for some reason, the phone is not charging. I'm going to try. We might have some technical difficulties with this very soon. I hope it stays alive, and then we'll stay connected. Um, the tabernacle there is called the Mikdash. It says they shall make me a Mikdash, which is a sanctuary, and I shall dwell within them. And that's the only time it's called Mikdash thereafter. Even though this Shoresh, Kuth Daled Shin, meaning sanctity, and other related concepts, is used throughout the book of Exodus. And thereafter, it's only called Mishkan or Omwit, which is kind of interesting. And from this, the sages derive, this isn't just Rambam talking, the Midrash Halacha has this. This is the source forever to build a sanctuary. One could have said, perhaps it was one-time commandment, build the tabernacle in the desert. After all, they were given a lot of one-time commandments in the desert. We just read in this week's Parsha, the entire Korban Pesach as Egypt was a one-time affair. So here, the sages are pointing out, no, the fact that the Ohel Moed and the Mishkan, both, they're one and the same, are referred to as Mikdash in this pasuk, it means that there's an eternal commandment, not just right now in the wilderness outside or at the foot of Mount Sinai, but forever there will be a commandment to build a Mikdash. We've already seen explicitly the construction of the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made. He gets the credit, even though, let's say, most of the work was done by Bitzalel and his assistants. And that was only temporary. He says, quotes a pasuk from Deuteronomy. Moshe Rabbeinu says, you haven't gotten here to the Minuhan and the Nahala, the resting place and the portion, which, once again, our previous series, we explained that whole pasuk at length. Then he says, once they entered the land of Israel, they set up the Mishkan in Gilgal, and it stayed there. They didn't move it from place to place in the land of Israel. Gilgal was right over the Jordan River, near Jericho. It's still in the Jordan Valley today. And it says it stood there for the 7 years that they were conquering the land. The 7 years they were dividing the land, or a total of 14. That's a tradition. You could perhaps derive that from the relevant scriptural sources that the Mishkan stood there for 14 years. I've seen some disputes, especially the length of the era of the judges, and also how long the combined reigns of Samuel, Saul, and David. We have a tradition, 57 years. Maimonides is going to go with that, although I've seen that perhaps it's not so clear. Perhaps everything in Seder Olam is a little bit too perfect, and I've discussed that also, the way the numbers work out too perfectly. Already Rishonim have made a note of this. I have not seen a completely satisfactory answer. I know how many have tried. It's like a pet project of theirs, but it's also it's besides our guys, children. Okay, thank you. So he says, "Umisham ba'u l'Shilo vanu sham bayit shalvanim ufarasu yiri otham mishkan alau." Then they went to Shiloh, built a permanent sanctuary there. Hold on a second. Yiladim, hey. No. They moved the sanctuary to Shiloh, and they built what they built there, and that was built as we described previously. And that's a quote from the Mishnah also. Ushloshmeot was Teisha Shanim Amad Mikdash Shiloh, and the Shiloh in the Mishkan there, or he calls it once again the Mikdash. He's emphasizing, as I pointed out in the previous Shurim, He's emphasizing that what was at Shiloh was a mikdash. That satisfied whatever biblical requirements existed at the time, and it was for 369 years. Ukshemeth Eli Charev, when Eli died, it was destroyed. And then it says, Ba'u Lenov Vanu Sham Mikdash. Even at Nov, they built a Mikdash, which the Rambam's emphasizing because it seems that they just reset the original tabernacle there. They didn't build anything that was new. They just, as a matter of fact, there was sort of a regression. There was no permanent structure there at all. It was the same Mishkan that had existed in the desert and at Gilgal, but still it's a Mikdash. It was destroyed when Shmuel died. And it came to Givon, which we've discussed also at length, and they built a mikdash there. And from Givon they came to the permanent location of the Mishkan of the mikdash. It's the temple in Jerusalem. We may know Givon Sheva b'chamishim shana. The entire time it stood at Givon was Nov and Givon combined is 57 years. It's even unclear. Notice even the sages have no clarity about this one. Certainly Maimonides is not going to add anything to this. The sages assume that combined years with Saul, Samuel, and David is 57. David's 40, so Samuel and Saul are given 17 years. How that's divided up is very unclear. It seems almost impossible to give 15 years to Samuel and just 2 years to Saul. Too much happened during his reign to limit him. I'd also like to point out at this point that the Mishnah that Maimonides is working with was in the last chapters of Vachim. And there they talk at length about the idea of the Heter Bamoth, also, which we discussed previously. The Heter Bamoth was a halachic status that has since passed. It stopped being relevant, once the temple was built. So Maimonides never discusses the halachot of the Heter Bamoth as they existed, because it already passed. It's not something that he ever even mentions in the Yad, except for one place when he talks about the importance of bringing the Korban Pesach Dafka in Jerusalem, specifically in Jerusalem, even when there was a Heter Bamoth. That's the only time we saw that he actually mentioned such a thing, La'alacha. So he's basically paraphrased the Mishnah. He's taken this idea. He doesn't want to get into the idea of the Heter Bamoth, which is not the point, but more like the history. And when we'll see in the first chapter, and also when he discusses the location of the Mizbeach and the Holy of Holies, he's also going to give us a little bit of a history lesson. You could have said that this whole paragraph over here is not so much a halacha, but more like history. The history here is quite important, and when we get to those chapters, we'll also explain again why it is that the history was actually included here. The third halacha says, "Kivan shnivna mikdash Yerushalayim ne'asru kol mikamot kulan livnot behen." Once the the mikdash, the sanctuary, was built in Jerusalem, all their places have been forbidden to offer in sacrifice to God, and also to build a temple for Him. There is no temple or an eternal temple except for in Jerusalem and on Mount Moriah, and Mount Moriah within Jerusalem. That's the only place you could ever build a temple again. King David, it says, when he discovered the place to build the altar, he had already known Jerusalem was where the temple has to be. That's why he had moved his capital there. It was only a few years later, or perhaps many years later, that God showed him where to build a temple, commanded him to build an altar on the threshing floor of Ornan or Aravna. It depends on which book you're reading, Samuel or Chronicles. In Chronicles, it says that once David had built that altar and the plague had stopped, he then made this exclamation. He understood, this is where God's temple should be. In Tehillim, it says that God, so to speak, has declared that this is my resting place forever. So Jerusalem was chosen, and from then on, they're no longer to be moving the temple again. And as last time also we discussed, the strange state of affairs, or perhaps the havaminas that one could have had with the status that there is a sanctuary in Givon, yet they already know that the sanctuary is to be moved to Jerusalem and the temple should be set up there. So perhaps there was a co-sanctuary or a co-mikdash state. They're both fit for sacrifice. And the answer was no. Jerusalem, even the altar that stood in front of where the Ark of the Covenant was, and even the altar, which is supposed to eventually become the permanent altar in the temple, those were just regular bamoth, permitted through the heter bamoth. They were just high places considered private altars. Whereas in Givon, that's where the service was conducted according to the Mosaic law and was limited only to Kohanim. And we saw the various halachot last time. The structure that Solomon built has already been explicated in the Book of Kings. The temple that is to be built, even though it's described in the Book of Ezekiel, Eno mifarash umvoar. It is not so clear. It's not explained well, even though there's a lot of details there. It's quite a few chapters long. Most haven't understood exactly what was meant there. We're getting an answer. No, sorry, that's not a question for the Shiur. Many Mefarshim have tried to give their own opinions and their own sketches of what the temple should look like according to Ezekiel, but there is no consensus there. So on Shei Bayith Sheni, so the people who lived at the beginning of the second temple, the ones who were constructing it, Kishabanu b'mei Ezra, when they built it in the times of Ezra, although Ezra was not present, Banuhu kivinyan shlomo u'me'ein dvarim hafumrashim b'Chezkel. They built it similar to the one that Solomon built, and also they incorporated that which was clear from the book of Ezekiel that they should include. That which they could understand, they tried to do, and that's why you look in classic commentaries, you look in Masechet Midot, you look in the good explanations, they usually have maps and the whole schematics, how the second temple looked, so we know what it looked like. But you see that you open up a Sefer Yechezkel and you have all different Mefarshim there, none of them look the same. They definitely don't match the second temple as we know it, which is perfectly described. And you could see what similarities, what was incorporated from the Ezekiel structure, or what might have been intended, and how it differed from, let's say, the first temple structure. I recommend also that just for getting kids excited about these things, there's some quite wonderful books that describe what both temples look like. From Machon Mikdash, Rabbi Makover has a good series on each of the Batei Mikdash as they were. I really enjoy that. I like showing those to the kids. I can't recommend them more. And you should go see them, see how the temple was, how a temple evolved. We don't know what was beyond the first temple, beyond the inner courtyard. There was an inner courtyard and apparently an outer courtyard, which also we mentioned last time. How the outer courtyard worked and where the various lishachot, the four corner, I guess, offices, the extra rooms, how those were laid out, we do not know. We know that there had to be other facilities in and around the temple, but we have no testament as to what they were, but they were there. Here's the Ikar of Binyan Abayith, although there probably could be more of it. I'll explain why. Osim bo Kodesh with Kodesh HaKodashim. We make a structure inside. One room is the Kodesh, the other is the Kodesh Kodashim. That means the holy area, the inner area, which is indoors, and the Sanctum Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies, which is beyond the Kodesh, inside, it's completely inside. And we get to the should be this vestibule. They call it the Ulam. That's the first room, even though it's not necessarily separated by the next room called the Kodesh by any wall or curtain. It's just a wider area. And God willing, we'll see a map and explain what this is. The Ulam is not present in the Mishkan. The Mishkan, as it stood in the desert, and its corresponding structure in Shilo, Nov, and Givon had no such Ulam. Someone walking into the temple walked directly into the Kodesh. And the three of them together are called the Heichal. Heichal is sometimes translated as palace, but obviously it's not a palace. It's just 3 rooms. It's a large building, but it's certainly not what you and I would consider a palace or castle. That's also not the correct word. It will just work with Heichal because there's no appropriate English translation. I wouldn't say sanctuary also, but it's the edifice of the sanctuary. It's the only room it's the only thing that has to be what you and I would call indoors. It's roofed and it has walls. We're going to see later something called an Achsadra, which is an area that has a roof, but no walls around it. So this is the only structure that's indoors in the temple. It's the only thing that's necessary. We make another partition that's sort of far away from the Heichal and surrounding it. Corresponds to the curtains of the Chatzer, the courtyard of the tabernacle as it exists in the desert. There are curtains surrounding the Oel Moed on four sides. Although the Oel Moed was on the west side of this resulting courtyard, it was 50 by 100 amot. For our purposes, we'll say that an amah is about 1.5 feet or half a meter. A little bit more than half a meter actually, but it's 1.5 feet for our purposes. Ideally, we're going to work with an amah that is 8 centimeters. An amah of 6 tefachim, and each tefach is 8 centimeters based on our best estimations. So an amah would be 48 centimeters, which is just less than half a meter. And that's what we're going to use from now on, although sometimes we're going to see in the next chapter, next week, that sometimes an amah is made out of 5 tefachim, which makes it a total of 40 centimeters. But for now, we'll work with this. So you can get an idea of how big the Chatzer was around the tabernacle. So a mechitza has to be built around the courtyard, around the Heichal, and that defines the inner courtyard. Of course, in the temple, they eventually built solid walls. There are stone walls, stone structures, and then there were even other rooms within those structures. For example, the Shkara Hagazith on the north side of the temple. That's where the Sanhedrin sat, although there was no such structure described, let's say, in the tabernacle in the desert. And then he says, anything within, contained within this mechitza, this enclosure, so that it corresponds to the Chatzer as existed of the Oel Moed. Hu hanikra azara. That's called the courtyard. Azara is close to the Hebrew word Ezra, which means help. The smichut, they're not the same word. The construct state of Azara is Ezrat. It sounds like help of, but it's not the same thing. It looks the same. And all of that's called sanctuary. So the basic definition of sanctuary, which by the way would once again define the Mishkan falls into that category, is a heichal, a building with these rooms inside it, and it's surrounded by a courtyard defined by the mechitzot. And minimally, the mechitzot are what we just said now. It could be curtains, but it could be stone structure. Also, we're going to see that the way the temples were built was it wasn't just these rooms inside a structure. There were actually also side rooms and even a second floor to it. All of those are not, like we said, the ikar, the critical component of a temple. We also make 7 vessels in the mikdash, in the sanctuary. Mizbach le'olav l'shar korbanot, an altar for the burnt offering and the rest of the korbanot. He says the olah and the rest of the korbanot. Why say just all the korbanot? Because sometimes it's called mizbach ha'olah, the altar of the burnt offering, even though there are many different types of korbanot, which God willing we'll see when we start the next book. For example, there's burnt offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, peace offerings, etc. Obviously, and even the meal offerings, all the libations, those all go on the mizbeach. Why didn't God just call it the mizbeach for the korbanot? No, it's called the mizbach ha'olah. So that's defined. It's apparently the most holy sacrifice. The chevesh she'olim bo mizbeach, and a ramp for which to ascend the altar. Its place is in front of the ulam. That's the first room of the heichal. Mashuch ladarom, but it's toward the south. That is, if a person were entering the temple courtyard from the east, he would encounter the altar before he would encounter the edifice of the temple. And the mizbeach is actually shifted a little bit to the east. When we draw pictures of the temple, sometimes we put north on top, and then the sanctuary edifice would be on the left side. But a lot of drawings put the edifice on top. They put west on top, which we're a little bit not used to that. North is on the east, south is on the north is on the right, south is on the left. and east is on the bottom. Those are the illustrations that I'm more used to, putting the west up on top. So a person entering, going straight ahead, would encounter the altar first. And like I said, the altar is more to the south. Certainly the ramp dominates the south side of the courtyard. The north side of the courtyard has other things, but no ramp going up the temple. And that ramp is also quite wide. We'll learn about it next week. Next, we said that. And a laver, a large tank of water with spigots from which the Kohanim would wash their hands. It says variously. Sometimes they have to wash their hands. It uses the more literal term that's used in Exodus. And the sages like the term lekadesh, which is a word that they use a lot of times. When we say kiddush on Shabbat, that's the same verb. But in this case, there's no cup of wine, there's no recitation. It means they ritually wash their hands and feet before the service. It says Raglihem Lavoda before the service. Its place is between the ulam, once again, the first room of the sanctuary edifice, and the altar. And it's also toward the south, just like the ramp and just like the altar itself. Shahu Sbo Hanichnas Mikdash. It's to the left of a person coming in to the Mikdash from the eastern gate. Mizbeach Laktoreth, another altar for the incense, a much smaller altar coated with gold, and that was actually put into the tabernacle. Menorah, and a candelabrum, the menorah, of course. Wishulchan, and a table, which is more like a rack. It was a table, as we know, 6 layers. It was the actual surface of the table plus 5 more shelves thereon, where they put the showbread. And those 3 are within the Kodesh in front of the Kodesh Kodeshim. That means a person entering the Kodesh would get to them before he gets to the Kodesh Kodeshim, and they're actually more toward the west. That is, he has to go there in the farther, the more inner side of the Kodesh. HaMenorah b'darom yismo niknas. The menorah is on the south, the left side. It's the left-hand side of the person entering the mikdash. The shulchan miyamin, the shulchan is on the right. She'alav lechem b'panim, and upon that was the showbread. U'shtehem b'tzad kodesh hakodeshim mibachutz. And both of them are, if you're looking from the outside, they're both towards the Kodesh Kodeshim. They're on the second half of the room, so to speak. Mizbeach HaKetoreth mashuch mibein shtehem lachutz. The Mizbeach HaKetoreth is in the middle of the room, and it's drawn more toward the outside. That means more toward the east, more toward the person coming into the Kodesh. V'osim b'toch ha'azara gvulim. Within the Azara, that's the outer courtyard. Well, by outer I mean beyond the inner of the Kodesh. It's the main courtyard. It's the only courtyard that could be considered an inner courtyard as far as courtyards go. Within that courtyard, there are limits where everybody could go. Ad kan li Yisrael. Israelites are allowed up to this point. This apparently, by the way, is a rabbinic enactment. I haven't seen a source for this. I haven't seen anybody claims that this is a biblical enactment, but this is saying that the sages at least assumed also, even if they hadn't enacted it, it's a rule that they gave us. Ad kan li Yisrael. This is a certain place. Regular Israelites cannot go beyond this point. But Levites and Kohanim could potentially go there. Ad kan la Kohanim. Even priests cannot go beyond a certain point. Uvonim ba batim l'shar tzorchei hamikdash. We also make other structures within the temple for the other temple purposes, storehouses, etc. Kol bayith mehem nikra lishka. And every one of these structures is called a lishka. By the way, I'm a stickler for purist Hebrew. The word misrad, office, is a new one. The more classic term for something similar to that, place of work, where someone's official place where he officiates is called a lishka in Hebrew. And in modern Hebrew also, people who are important, for example, a mayor of a city doesn't have a misrad, he has a lishka. So I prefer that word. Next. When we build the Heichal and the Azara, we use large stones, perhaps better than the cut ones. If you don't have stones, so we use bricks. And what's the difference between stones and bricks? Stones are hewn, natural minerals ones. whereas bricks are man-made. They're used some sort of cement or other materials. I'm not a brick maker, I don't know this, but they're usually use fire and all that. Sometimes bricks are better for certain purposes. Cinder blocks, as we know, we build a lot of buildings out of those, or we use reinforced concrete. But technically speaking, bricks are permissible. We do not cut these stones on the Temple Mount. They're hewn, and that means they're drawn from the stone. They quarry them from the mountains, and then they shape them and chisel them outside before they bring them to the place where they're to be constructed. Then they're included in the construction. It says in the book of Kings that Solomon obtained these stones for construction, large stones, and then it says yakaroth, expensive ones. The shoresh yakar is related to the Hebrew shoresh kaf bet dalid. Kaf bet dalid is the shoresh of the word kavod, respect and glory, or just dignity. And sometimes it's also the shoresh for weight. Koved is heaviness, or the weight of something. Kaved means something that's heavy. And it's usually translated into Aramaic using the shoresh yud kuf resh. In Hebrew, yud kuf resh is deer. But when we say, let's say there's a kli yakar, classic commentary use this as his name, a kli yakar would mean it's a heavy kli. And if you're talking about something that's made out of gold or silver, its heaviness is because it has a lot of gold and silver in it, and therefore it's expensive. So yakar became the Hebrew word for expensive or costly or valuable. So avanim karot in this case means large stones, but they're also costly because they're precious stones. They're not just any cheap regular stone. They're using, for example, marble. Okay, and it seems that that's, for example, what Herod used in his construction. He used a very nice marble. It says in the book of Kings also that you didn't hear the sound of the hammer and the other metal devices that they used to chisel stone and cut the stone. They didn't hear any of that. You wouldn't hear any of that when the temple was being built. All of that noise was being made outside. Nowadays, I guess they would use jackhammers. You wouldn't hear that in the temple area while the temple was under construction because they made sure to do that elsewhere. This is there a biblical source for this rule? I don't know. It certainly is the minhag. I think the Ramban agrees that there's no requirement, but that is what they did. That is a fact of history, and perhaps that's a good thing. This is, by the way, this is not the same halacha which we'll see soon, which is that the altar is even higher standard, not allowed to cut those stones at all with metal, even beyond the temple. You have to use clean stones, if the stones have irregularities, what you do is you put them in the mold, then they pour the concrete, whatever the stuff that's basically liquid, and then sets, and that smooths out the differences in the stone. We don't build within it. And there's a circle that says an ambiguous word there. There's no wood that's sticking out. They used, for example, in the building of the temple, wooden rafters. The wooden structure and a wooden frame holds up the stone of the roof and of the walls, which are quite tall. But you couldn't have any of this wood exposed. There's actually a good machloketh here. They bring some of the sources here. Kapach brings other ones. What exactly was the limitation? You're not supposed to have wood in the temple courtyard. It's reminiscent of the prohibition of having asherot, which is trees dedicated to avodah zarah, the idol tree. So there are various opinions about how it was. I'll read it here. L'dath Rashi Ramban Yisur Zehu B'chol Har-Bayit. According to Rashi and Nachmanides, this prohibition is in the entire Temple Mount area. L'dath Rava Yisur Dafka Bazarel Mishar Nicanor. According to Ravad, it's the only applies to the inner courtyard. In the outer courtyards already, in the rest of the Temple Mount, you could have wood showing there, and they have different expressions here. What it means that they can't have it, the wood showing, and the various reasons. So it points out you could, as long as the wood isn't showing. If you have the wood actually covered up, like it was in the temple's edifice, so there is no such problem. That's why the Rambam says eitz boleit. Once again, that word over there, bo, is ambiguous. Okay, we keep getting more messages, but nothing directly about the shiur, so we'll just continue. Anybody have a question here? No, okay. Anybody else need a copy of the Rama, by the way? We have some more in the base bedrooms behind me. There's some more of these editions and also some more of the Frankel ones inside. He says, "Ve'enosin achsadrayot shel eitz b'cho azra ella shel avanim olevenim." Also, these achsadriot, I mentioned achsadra is a structure with a roof, but no walls. They wouldn't make those out of wood in the temple. Instead, they would make them out of avonim or levinim. Once again, whole stones or out of brick. Umratzvim calls rab avanim karoth. We pave the temple courtyard with precious stones, not necessarily diamonds and rubies and things like that, unless if they could afford it. We'll see if there's halakha that perhaps would allow for such a thing, but we don't use the cheap stuff. Nowadays, by the way, we have a hakpadah in Jerusalem that many fancy places are, they pave them with Jerusalem stone. Jerusalem stone is not the best form of pavement, by the way, because it eventually gets slippery in the rain. It wears away quickly because it's a soft stone. So that, even though that's expensive, and there is a takana on the books since the mandatory era, in order to preserve Jerusalem's particular character, that anybody who builds anything in Jerusalem has to build it with at least the facade of Jerusalem stone. That's what they do everywhere. Is that considered avinim karoth? Nowadays it wouldn't be. You have to use something nicer. Like I said, they use types of marble. You get the fancier balatot, nothing that you'd use in your house, but something really the expensive stuff. That's what it means. It doesn't mean necessarily diamonds, or let's say the stones that were used in the Kohen Gadol's breastplate. So you use these precious stones. If let's say a stone becomes loose, there's a fault in the floor, so it's still there in its place, but it's not sturdy. A person walks on it, you can feel it's moving a little bit. Because it's already has a problem, it's pasul. That means a kohen should not step on there while he's performing service. It's forbidden for a kohen to serve and stand on that place until it's set back into the ground like it's supposed to be. It doesn't mean he has to take care of it right now. Perhaps they don't have the right artisan who could do such a thing, so they could just avoid that particular spot on the floor of the temple until they get it fixed. So I hope they would do so quickly. By the way, it makes sense that just like we're going to see at the end of this book that sacrifice should only be from the mufchar, the best. So too, when it comes to fixing things around the temple, they shouldn't have delay. They would want it fixed right away, so they would do it right away. It is a choicest form of the commandment, to perform the commandment to strengthen the building and to raise it up, not literally, as much as the tzibur, the community can. Depends on their funds. It says in Sefer Ezra that people started donating and took upon themselves basically hora keva on a yearly basis to upkeep the temple. They glorify it, they make it as nice as much as they can. If they could coat the entire temple with gold and also make everything there as big as possible, that is a command. And by the way, that is historical precedent. The tabernacle itself, the structure of the tabernacle, the Olam Moed, was wooden boards coated inside and out with gold. A person saw the Mishkan from the outside. If the part of the walls that he could see, those were gold. Inside, everything was gold. Solomon also made the inside of the temple entirely gold. Kodesh and the Shim. And they say that Herod, for example, sorry about that, says that he had that Havamina and the sages persuaded him not to. They said it looked just as beautiful as it was. And there was a temple fund that we've mentioned also at the end of Masechet Shkalim, the Zahav La Kaporet, even though they made the Kodesh Kodeshim of the second temple very nice inside, beauty, it was a thing of beauty. There was always a temple fund to donate extra money in order to create new golden, new golden sheets to cover over the walls of the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodeshim in order to beautify it. So this is, God willing, something we'll have to do also in the future. Ein boniyat hamikdash b'layla shneimar v'yom hakimin l'mishkan b'yom hakimin v'lo b'layla. There's only a commandment to build a temple by day, not at night. And they also say, that's derived from that verse in Bamidbar that he quotes here. And we engage in the construction of the temple from dawn until nightfall, not from the zricha to the shkia. In this case, he's more machmir. Sometimes for certain dinim, we say that zricha is it. For example, Shemon Esrei ideally is only once the sun rises. But for most mitzvahs of the day, we start from dawn. That is the crack of dawn. Once it starts getting light outside, even before the sun rises. And Tzedek Kochavim is when the stars come out. That's a significant amount of time after the sun sets. According to Rambam, that's not a lot of time. He says basically 20 minutes, just less than 20 minutes. Well, we would say it's 18 minutes according to the Rambam's calculations. So 18 minutes after the sun goes down, they stop the construction of the temple, even though, technically speaking, they start more than 18 minutes before sunrise in the morning. Everybody's required to help themselves physically and monetarily. Everybody. Anashim unashim, men and women, kimikdash hamidbar, just like the mikdash, once again, mikdash, he calls the Ol Moed mikdash, the sanctuary of the desert, where everybody contributed first of whatever they had, their gold and silver, whatever other precious items they had to contribute to that, and also they took physical part. The women were sewing and weaving all sorts of things, and the men were doing other things. And that's important. Everybody has to help. And then it says, Shalo yivnuhu, hold on one second, let's skip this. Mikdash midbar ve'ein mevatlin tinokot shel Beit Rabban labinyan ve'ein minam mikdash tochei yom tov. It says here that we still send children to school. Tinokot shel Beit Rabban is the children have to continue learning Torah all the time, every day. There's no such thing as a day off for children except on Tisha B'Av, if Chas v'Shalom they're observing Tisha B'Av, which will never happen again in history, God willing, because we'll get rid of it when we build a temple. But you're not supposed to stop the children from learning, so someone has to be teaching them, as many people as necessary. And we don't build the Mikdash on Yom Tov. The commandment to build Mikdash does not override Yom Tov. You might have a Havamina that it could, and the answer is not. Just like we learn Shabbos, everything that's forbidden on the Sabbath is derived from what they were doing in order to construct the tabernacle in the desert. So we know from there very clearly that the commandment to build the temple does not override the Sabbath. That should be clear, but also Yom Tov. Yom Tov, not everything is Asur. Perhaps Yom Tov because, unlike the Sabbath, there's an actual commandment to visit the temple. If there is no such temple, perhaps you should be building the temple on the Yom Tov so that you can fulfill your commandment to visit the temple and bring sacrifice there. That's one of the regalim. Kamash Balon, no, the construction of the temple does not override Yom Tov. HaMizbeach eino sinoto ela binyan avanim. We only make the Mizbeach out of stones. It says in at the end of Parshat Yithro, build me an altar of earth. And by the way, even in the Mishkan, they didn't build an altar of earth. It says he built it out of a wooden frame covered by bronze. So it's been pointed out in Farshim, but they then filled that with earth wherever they stopped. It was hollow. When they would encamp in Shittim or Arvoth Moav, they would then fill it with local dirt until it came time to go. So what does it mean if you would Mizbach Adama Tasali Sheyeh Mechubar Ba'adama? It means that the Mizbeach should always be attached to the ground. It has to be a structure stuck to the ground. There should be no hollows in the ground underneath it. Like most of the Temple Mount was actually hollow underneath. We know the Temple Mount is basically a building. Now it's a block. After all that's been done to it, it's hollow and it's also rectangular on all sides. There's a lot of empty spaces under the Temple Mount. That's on purpose. And we're going to see later that's for reasons of Tuma and Tara and also for other reasons. So that's there, but the Mizbeach has to be directly over where there's just solid earth underneath, even though there might be a gap there. For example, see the Shittim, there was a passage that went all the way under the ground, like a vertical tube that went there. And the Mizbach Adama, so you're going to build the Mizbeach out of stone, it's going to be connected to the ground. It says, if you will build me a Mizbeach Avanim, a person could read the parsha at the end of Yithro and say, well, there's multiple ways to build a Mizbeach. You can build it out of dirt or you can make it out of stones. No, it is supposed to be made out of stone eventually. we have tradition that when it says Mizbach Avanim Ta'aseli, it means you should. It means not if you'll come the time. It's an obligation. You have no way out of it, which is the way they understood it. I was about to show the kids this morning where Rabbi Macover wrote. He brings all the different opinions. What was the nature of the tabernacle altar in Shilo and in Novin Givon? Did they make was it the Moses tabernacle? Was it the Moses? Sorry, was the Moses altar filled with dirt once again? Or did they do like they did in the temple, make a solid stone altar, a whole stone altar that was attached to the ground? Different opinions existed throughout the ages, but that's also not relevant because that's not where we're going to do it in the future. Any stone that has become blemished, it's missing a piece, you can actually feel it with your knife, with your fingernail. They say that when you check the knife for shchita, so what you have to do is you pass the knife over your fingernail thusly. It says once in this direction like that, and also all the sides. Just checking how it is for imperfections, also over the skin. So if the knife catches the nail, so that means there's imperfection in the knife and it's not fit for ritual slaughter. So too, you can check the stones. You have to pass your fingernail over the stones to see if it has an imperfection. So anything like that, the standard, okay, then it's already considered invalid. It says kasakin shel shchita, just like the knife for ritual slaughter. Harezo psula kevesh v'lamizbeach. It's unfit for use in the ramp and for the altar. Shneimar, as it says, avanim shneimot tivneh eth mizbach Hashem Elokecha. It says you shall use whole stones to build the altar of the Lord thy God. Where would they get the stones for the altar? Min b'thulat hakarka, from the virgin earth, means earth that had never been touched by anybody. You have to dig in the earth, make sure your shovel isn't metal and it can touch the stones they're eventually going to use. You dig into the ground until you can get to the part where you see that no one's ever built here or used this, did any work here. Okay, new earth. And you take the stones out of there. You take the stones out from that earth. Omin hayam agadol. Or you go to the sea. You go out, send a boat out to the sea, and you can go find untouched stones there that no one ever used. Uvonim bahen, and use those for the construction. So too, the stones to build the heichal, the azoth, shleimot hayu. They used whole stones, although there isn't this hakpada necessarily. We see why, because the mizbeach, if anything metal touched it, barzel, iron, the strong metal that we used to cut things, that would disqualify them. Avnei heichal and azaroth necessarily are not going to be disqualified just because they were touched or hewn with metal, though. Avnei heichal azaroth shenifkaru o shenigmamu. If you have imperfections in the stones of the sanctuary edifice or of the azaroth, pisulot, they're also disqualified. Once they become broken, so you can't be redeemed. Redeemed means that the temple's treasury gets money from someone who wants to buy it off of the temple. That money, it receives the sanctity from those stones, and now the stones can be used for other purposes. They become private property. So in this case, no, we don't allow pidyon. They stay holy forever. They have to be put in geniza. They're buried, put away where no one will touch them again. They can't be used again. Any stone that has been touched by iron, or in this case, any metal that we use to make implements like knives and other weapons, cannot be used for the construction of the altar or for the ramp. Because it says in the pasuk, once again going back to Parashat Yithro, this mizbeach says, "You've waved your sword against my altar, and you've desecrated it." Chazal said it's not right that the altar, which is there to extend children, Yeladim, it's not right that the altar is there to extend men's lives and achieve atonement for them, should be desecrated with iron, which shortens man's life. A person who constructs a stone that was even touched by iron into the altar or its ramp, loket, he is lashed. And Amar kilotiv ne'aten gazi. You shall not build them with hewn stone. You shouldn't build the mizbeach with hewn stone. So a person who does so has violated a commandment just like any other, and he's punished for it. Evan pagum over ba'aseh. Person who puts in a blemished stone, one that's missing something, it wasn't because iron it got hit against another stone or for whatever reason it cracked on its own. That's just a prohibition. It's not like one of the thou shalt nots. It says over ba'aseh. He has violated a positive commandment to use whole stones, so it's a deficient commandment in this case. Even shenifgema o shenagabar barzel achar shenivnei b'mizbeach otavim pesulav ashar ksheroth. If the excuse me, if a stone was actually harmed, it became deficient once it was already part of the mizbeach, so it itself is pasul, but the rest is still kasher. We whiten the mizbeach twice a year. This is on the assumption that mizbeach, unlike its original counterpart, which was coated in bronze, this one is actually coated in white plaster. So they re-whiten it. Well, sorry about that. They whiten it twice a year, before Passover and before Sukkot. When we put on this new plaster, we just use a cloth to apply it, and not, let's say, the normal iron implement like the spackle that we normally use. And others say no, use something made out of wood. But the point is, we don't use metal to do this. Shema yigaba even yivsol, because all he has to do is touch one of the stones and he'll ruin it. By the way, they do bring in metal implements, iron, into the temple on a regular basis near the altar. For example, there was all sorts of hooks that they would use to hold sacrifice that needed to be disemboweled and skinned, and of course the knives for slaughtering, among other metal items. And those knives were made out of iron. So we aren't worried that a Kohen would accidentally touch the altar with his slaughtering knife. That wasn't done. They kept some distance. The Kohanim were especially vigilant not to do such a thing. Ein osin madrigot lamizbeach. We don't make steps leading up to the altar. It has to be an actual ramp. Shnemar lo taleb b'ma'alot al mizbechi. Says don't go up on steps up to my altar. And some say also this to prevent the psia gasa, so that the Kohen not take a wide step. So even if there is an altar, if there is a ramp going up to the altar, he should make sure to take short steps. Other Rishonim pointed out, the Rambam has pointed out elsewhere, those wedding march steps where they just like don't go, one foot should not go beyond the other. It says the toe to heel to toe walk, so as not to take large steps. Ella bonin kamotel b'midramosh mizbeach. We make it like a ramp going up the south side of the altar. Mitmayt v'yored mirosh mizbeach ad haaretz. Keeps descending from the top of the mizbeach until it gets to the ground. V'hu hanikra kevesh, and that's what they call the ramp. A person who goes up, puts steps going up to the mizbeach, whatever, he brought steps over there, constructed steps, he ascended the altar using steps, so he would be lashed. A person who uproots a stone from the altar or from the sanctuary edifice or from anywhere between the ulam and the mizbeach in a destructive manner, he is lashed. A person who needs to repair it, and that's his job, he's taking out the stone in order because repair has to be done, that's okay. But if he does it destructively, he is lashed also. Shenemar, says with regards to idolatry there in Deuteronomy, in Parashat Re'eh, it says you should destroy all their altars, etc. When they get to the land of Canaan, there's going to be a massive destroying all the avodah zarah and everything, all its accoutrements and paraphernalia. That has to be destroyed. And that says, Lo tasum kein l'Hashem Elokechem. Don't do for the Lord thy God. Anything that's dedicated to his service cannot be destroyed. Next, the menorah and its various, also the extra kelim they use for the menorah, the tongs, and the shulchan and its utensils, and the altar for the Ketoreth, and all the other temple vessels. They should only be made out of metal. Yeah, but many of them were made out of gold and silver and sometimes bronze. The major ones I listed before, the menorah and the shulchan and the incense altar, were all made of solid gold, or at least gold-covered wood. So why is he telling us that we can't make that? We can only make them out of metal because sometimes they're poor. The Tosefta and other sources mention how the Maccabees, for example, they entered a temple which had been robbed of everything. They didn't even have menorah. The miracle of the oil took place on a menorah that was made out of basically spears, repurposed wooden spears covered in the cheapest metal they had, what was available. So they could use that, and only then, once the Maccabean rulers had more victories and they were able to take more spoils against from their oppressors, were they able to remake the temple appointments as they should have been out of gold. It says, if they're made from wood or bone or stone or glass, they're psulim. I think that maybe you can make a very nice menorah out of glass. No, that doesn't count. You have to make it out of some sort of metal. Even tin is better than glass. So if the community is poor, osinotan afilu shel badil. So make them out of tin. That was the cheapest metal they had nowadays. Nowadays, maybe we use aluminum. Shiur, if they got rich, osinotan shel zahav. They should make them out of gold, like it's described. Afilu hamizrakot. Even the cups for catching the blood. That's what they do. The main sacrificial services, someone slaughters the animal, and the blood that comes out right when the animal first dies, that's caught in the blood and then thrown on the altar. Even those, often those were made out of silver. Those should make out of gold also. The skewers and the combs, various things for, let's say, stoking the fire and moving the coals around. Even those, the amidot, were things they used to measure the amounts of flour and oil, etc. If the tzibur, the community, can handle it, osinotan shel zahav. They should make those out of gold. Even the doors of the courtyard, means the gates, those should be made out of gold if they have it. Just, and this harks back to the halacha we saw earlier, that if they can, they should make the entire temple structure coated in gold. That's the ideal. I don't think they ever got to this point. The Nicanor gates, for example, were not made out of gold, but they're still considered very good, and also because a miracle happened to them, so they kept them for all that time. Any kli is only made l'chadchila. That means its original intention is for hekdesh. It can't be they repurpose things, or they just find like, wow, really nice cups, let's use those for the temple. No, they have to be made specifically for the temple from the beginning. If they're made even for any non-temple purpose, hedyot is ordinary purpose, so we don't use them for gavoa. It means high up. It means for the temple purposes. Uchlei gavoha. We don't turn them into clay gavoa. We don't say that they can be now used for the temple. It's so good. We can't say, well, here the Queen of England has all these fancy vessels hidden away or whatever it is. So if she donates those to the temple, now we can use them. No, they're already puzzle. However, if they've never been used for temple purposes, a hedyot, an ordinary person could use them. Once they've been used for temple purposes, they are now forbidden for ordinary purpose. Even if a person hewed stones or cut wood, there was wooden beams for the purpose of building a synagogue. Synagogue is also holy. It's also God's. It's called a mikdash me'at, a minor sanctuary. Ein boninotan lahar habayit. We do not use them for the Temple Mount. And by the way, this was the first instance where Rambam equates the entire Temple Mount with the mikdash, as we saw last time. In this case, it says the entire Temple Mount, you can't use any materials that have originally been designated for another purpose, even to build the synagogue. So when we get building the temple, all the supplies, concrete and the stone and the wood that we're going to use is going to be designated from the outset for temple purposes. Thank you very much for joining us now. We cover the first chapter. God willing, next week we'll cover the next chapter. And I hope starting tomorrow, this will be of extreme practical importance, unlike it was last week. So have a good week, and God bless.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.